welcome to BETAC. We continue with our next session. It is called Skin, with Sherrod Paul, introduced by Gavin Francis. Welcome to the speakers, and the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Christoph, and hello and welcome to Jaipur Literary Festival. And I just want to introduce myself briefly. My name's Gavin Francis. I'm a writer and a doctor who's particularly fascinated by cultural, philosophical aspects of medicine and the body. And it's my tremendous pleasure today to chair Dr. Sherrod Paul. Dr. Paul is a skin specialist based in New Zealand. He also works 1 week a month in Brisbane in Australia. He's the recipient of New Zealand's highest medical award for his work on skin and skin cancer. He's also fascinated by the social, the cultural, and even the racial aspects of skin. And for the next 40 minutes, we're going to explore that. So for the first, he's going to talk for 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes. Then we will have a discussion here on stage, and we'll be sure to leave time open for questions. Then after we've finished those questions, Dr. Paul will be in the signing booth just outside. And so if you have any further questions that you don't get the opportunity to ask, please do come and speak to him there. So could you all give a warm round of applause for Dr. Paul?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Gavin. It's a real pleasure to be here in Jaipur. It's my first trip here. So it's been really wonderful, just walking around and taking everything in. So really, to the organizers, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Speaking on skin, actually, what I originally planned to speak about when I left home gradually changed when I came here and I read the newspapers. And I looked at all the publicity about the discussion around the Oscar ceremony and people talking about the lack of black actors or diversity, and also reading the Indian papers about the Dalit lad who committed suicide, and whatever I don't know the story any more than what I've read in the newspapers, but I thought, hang on, this is a time to explain scientifically how caste, color, and indeed good health are all linked. The funny thing is, skin is a unique organ because we all have skin. There are no creatures which don't have skin. A single-cell creature has skin, whales have skin, we have skin. So they're creatures without hearts, like, for example, a starfish has no heart, but it loves eating oysters, or rather it heartlessly shucks them. So you have creatures like the sea squirt, which have no brains, but they still have skin. The other thing about skin is, that's the first thing people notice when they see you. So for me, in some ways, coming to India is like coming to my roots, and I always get a degree of what I call cutaneous comfort. Because if I travel through, Australia, which still has vestiges of their white Australia policy, when I go there, like Gavin said, about 10 times a year, allowing for the university holidays, and I've done that for over 12 years. And I can tell you that every time I go through the airport, I'm the one picked out for a random special treatment. It's completely random, and it's only, it just happens to be me every time. So I have the record, I think, of having maybe being frisked 120 times. So I remember coming to India, I remember a quote I think Mandela once said about himself and Oliver Tambo and what they meant for Africa. And I'm paraphrasing him, saying coming to India is coming to a place where I can find a sympathetic ear, a comfortable ally, and not be turned away, and also where men may be proud to be represented by someone of their own skin color. But today, appropriately, the book I'm going to talk about is called Skin, a Biography. And in my presentation, I'm going to tell you as to why dividing people by race is really rubbish, and why the caste system is actually crap, and why actually India does what it does so poorly at the track and field at the Olympics, and they're all linked. So the other thing is there's a interesting word, the French use a word called dépassement, which means, feeling not at home. And you see, I was born in England, and then my parents came to India to do medical mission work, and then I now live in New Zealand and Australia. So, wherever I'm home, it's not quite really home. So when I was in England, people thought I was too Indian, and when I was in India, people thought I was too English. And when I'm in New Zealand, people often think I'm Maori, and when I go to Australia, everybody thinks I'm Italian. Right? So even in my medical training, it sort of ended up like that. So I did medicine, and I first trained in surgery, then actually did general practice, ended up specializing in skin cancer. I studied medical law and ethics, so I'm really full of useless information. So at the end of the session, you just feel free to ask me questions. So one of the things I wanted to say is in Queensland, where I teach, the Aboriginal people, they have a term called going walkabout. So basically, it means the Aboriginals go out into the wilderness for a few days, and they walk around just tracing what they call the song lines of their ancestors. The idea being you go back to the past and you come back with a renewed vigor to face the future. So this book was really me going walkabout for skin. So I went into the forests of academia trying to see the wood for the trees. And I became more and more curious as to not only how did we all develop our different skin colors, but how did we actually develop more importantly, our attitudes towards skin color? And how did, for example, in India, the caste system evolve? And there's actually a scientific explanation for all of that. A little bit about my family is actually pertinent because when we're talking about skin and skin color, everybody in my family is a doctor, and it's barring one, and it's almost like we were afflicted by some strange genetic mutation. So we had dermatologists, surgeons, psychiatrists, plastic surgeons, so on and so forth. And the only person in my family, my grandma actually did medicine at a time when women and men did medicine, but women could only call themselves licensed medical practitioners, and men became doctors. And my grandfather, he was the only one who escaped the fate, thankfully, and he was actually a pastor, a minister of a church. This was pre-independence. And I was looking through my family album, and I found a picture of my grandfather, and he was wearing this turban, and he was standing ankle deep in snow. And I thought it was very strange because part of India we come from, nobody wears a turban, even for weddings. So I wondered about that, and I asked my dad, and he said that my grandfather was invited for the World Council of Churches in Norway, after which he had to travel through America. And he was told when he was about to come to America that could he bring along a turban. So they struggled to find a turban, and they ended up making a really terrible turban, which he wore, and that was really because they said if he wore the turban, he would still be black, but he would be a more acceptable shade of black, and he would be quite safe traveling through Southern America. So I thought, that was another interesting story, a family story. And I thought about it because he was traveling through South Carolina, and as you know, recently, Dylan Roof, a very misguided young man, went into a church in Charleston, and he gunned down 9 people. And during the time, he just sat down as if he was sitting down for a Bible study lesson, and he said he was just there to kill black people. Now, I was just thinking, that was the sort of church my grandfather would have spoken in. And I was in Tampa recently, and they were actually holding, on the day I was there, a candlelight vigil for the victims of Charleston. And it's actually interesting because it was in a park called the Likes Gaslight Park, but on the day there were actually more candlelights than gaslights, and people were there to mourn the victims. And I remember thinking about a quote from Carl Sagan, famous astronomer, who once said, you know, if we've been bamboozled for too long, we become a victim of the bamboozle, and we stop questioning it, or something to that effect. So he says the bamboozle captures us, and we no longer seek the truth. So discussions about caste and color are sometimes like that. You know, politicians, pseudoscientists, various people with vested interests have twisted the truth and forgotten the science. And so today, I think what I really wanted to emphasize in my talk is the science behind it. Can I just have the... So a few slides which particularly caught my eye. The first one was I was looking at this matrimonial ads when I landed here, not out of personal interest, but they were really neatly classified by caste, but also majority of them said fair or very fair, right? So the second one was headline in the Sunday Times, which said heart attacks claimed 80 people a day in Mumbai. And actually the reason I put that up was that this actually has something to do with our skin. And thirdly, this was an article I found which said we have 17 medals and 1 billion people. It's actually 1.2, I think. Every time I come here, it goes up a little bit. And they said that we have never won an Olympic track and field medal. And there is an explanation if you look at the world through the eyes of skin. So like I said, skin is our largest organ. It's a sense organ. So if you think about skin, you know, you can look life through skin and learn a lot. So for example, I was studying these creatures called the sea squirt. It's very good to study skin on marine creatures, and we actually get a lot of extracts from them. But this sea squirt is unique because it's a creature which sort of walks around the bottom of the ocean, crawling about on tentacles, and then till it finds a rock it falls in love with. It falls in love with the rock, grabs hold of the rock, and never lets go. At this point in time, for the rest of its life, it's stuck on this rock, and it starts digesting its brain. So there is a moral of the story here. So if you fall in love and get married, and all you're going to do is sit in front of the TV, you may as well eat your brain. So looking at the past to the present, I'm going to walk you through skin evolution. So what this is we're going to go on our walkabout through skin, and we're going to skin humanity itself. And what we're going to understand at the end is, I like to say this, is skin is not just an organ, it is both humanity's message and messenger. So if you look at this, that's me with Louise Leakey of the famous Leakey family, who are paleontologists and who were digging in the Turkana Basin. And Louise was telling me that about, they find some fossils where primitive hominids were using hand tools about 3.3 million years ago. But modern man, that is man in our form, came into Africa, evolved about 200,000 years ago, so it's relatively very recent. And okay, can everybody hear me now at the back? Yeah, thank you. So only in the last 100,000 years, people migrated out of Africa and traveled to other continents. So one of the things I do in tracking this is it really interested me because I also work with animals. So the funny thing when you work with animals, and I do reconstructive surgery on humans, is you need to be very careful. So for example, that's me tempting a lemur who had a tumor on its tail down from a tree to try and examine him. But lemurs are an interesting case study because they evolved about 56 million years ago, and they were one of the first creatures with front-facing eyes. So, obviously you've got eyes at the back like a frog, you can't see what's going on. So a lemur, as you can see, is taking the apple off me quite nicely. And this was an orangutan in the Auckland Zoo, and she couldn't hang properly, so I was called to try and see what the problem was. And all these stories are in my book, of course. So that's me operating on the orangutan. The funny part of the story was about 1 hour later, I was actually operating on a very prominent political family. And I was thinking, I can't actually tell her who my last patient was. I bet she's Or she's going to say, I bet he trained in India, I bet he's a monkey doctor. But that's the sort of gratitude you get, you say. So the entire tale of two vitamins which shaped skin color is fascinating because as human beings evolved in Africa 100,000 years ago, their skin had become black over 28 million years to preserve folic acid. So as we know, we need folic acid to reproduce. So if you have low levels of folic acid, you get higher birth defects. So there are studies which actually show that a slum in Bombay, for example, has a lower birth defect rate than a wealthier suburb in Belgium. So really, when in India, for example, it wasn't part of traditional medical training to prescribe folic acid, whereas in the West, you only have to think about getting pregnant when you're given folic acid. So what happened is, as the skin darkened to preserve folic acid, because you were in sunlight and harsh conditions. But why did we actually lose fur? And that was because the brain is all about movement. And this was why I was telling you the story about the sea squirt. So as humans moved more, the brain became larger. So it was all to do with movement. So the more they moved, they started walking on two legs, they developed a larger brain. And as we know, the brain is nothing but a computer. So if you have a computer, you need a larger cooling system. So therefore, you lost fur and only retained hair, but you retained hair on your head, or most of us, because of the fact that that's where the computer was housed. So what happened over time is skin in Africa became dark, but as people migrated to Europe, the skin lightened because there was no sun for 6 months of the year, so people had to lighten their skin to absorb vitamin D. So what happened is, as we know, it's a constant battle between vitamin D and folic acid, and when people then migrated towards Asia again the skin darkened once again to preserve folic acid, because evolution is all about propagating the species. So the key thing here was that from apes, which were like 28 million years ago, to the first humans, which were 100,000 years ago, the skin lightened over such a large period of time that African people developed very high pre-vitamin D levels, which we don't have in Asia. Because as people migrated over from Europe, only happened the last 10,000 years, the skin darkened to preserve folic acid, but it was over a shorter period of time. So what we can actually do is, we did a study where we took traditional people in Tanzania who are very dark, and we compared the vitamin D levels, which should be very low because of the fact that they have dark skin, and compared it with Indian skin. And we found that they actually had 4 times the vitamin D of Indian skin or Asian skin, but twice as that much of Europeans. And I explain the significance of it in a minute. So look at this is a map of folic acid levels in world populations. So really all this talk about, Asia and Africa are just breeding because they're not educated, that's largely not true. To a large degree, the higher the folic acid levels, the better you are a breeder. So you can see the populations of the world correlate directly with skin color. So the darker continents have higher density of population. So that's why virtually all my Indian patients are vitamin D deficient, but this has specific things bearing to do with India. It's because what happened when you are vitamin D deficient, and secondly, people avoid going out in the sun, and what happens is then you develop a lower level of vitamin D. In turn, it develops a lower level of calcium. But here's what the paradox or the complication is. If you eat a lot of dairy, as we do in India, yogurt and milk, without correcting the vitamin D level, it increases your calcium inside your cells, which means it leads to heart disease and diabetes. So that's the real reason for the epidemic of heart disease and diabetes in India. So it's really, really important to correct vitamin D. So I'm going to give you now just 3 questions. The first question is, where was Darwin wrong? So Darwin said that because he saw the Aboriginal people in Australia who were dark, who were actually out of the original stock from Africa, and he saw the Eskimos, and he thought that where people live doesn't coincide with corresponding differences in climate. He was wrong, and I was illustrating this to a group of students just a few weeks ago because one day a week I teach writing to children who can't read and write properly. And I was talking to them about the story called The Polar Bear Son. And I said to them, listen, if you shaved the polar bear, what color is the skin? And typically everybody thinks it's white because the fur is white, because it's been bleached. But polar bear skin is jet black. And the Inuit, the Eskimos there, also have dark skin. Why did this happen? This happened because those people's diet, both the Eskimos and the polar bear, was so high in salmon and cod, and salmon has 1,200 international units of vitamin D per teaspoon, that they already had enough vitamin D, so their skin didn't need to lighten like the rest of the Europeans. So the second point is caste all about cuisine or about what we ate? So I was in Iceland at a conference, and then I just stepped into the Miss World competition, purely for research, of course. And so this is a picture of Miss Norway and Miss Estonia, and you can look at the picture and you can see who has a better tan. And what this was is the three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, had much warmer currents. So the people who came in there, they used to farm grain. And if you eat grain has no vitamins. The current cereals we have are all fortified. So over time, it doesn't happen in your lifetime. So you can't just say, I'm going to become vegetarian and become fair overnight. But over generations, you stimulate your genes and you get lighter skin. In contrast, people like the Norwegians and others had a diet very high in salmon and cod, and they were eating whales and all other things. So over time, they had developed an ability to tan. So if you now think about the caste system in India, say the upper class people traditionally, as we're called, were all vegetarians. So what happened is, if you were largely vegetarian over generations, and what happened was, and you didn't eat fish, what happened, your skin lightened to absorb more vitamin D. So over time, you became lighter skinned. Hence, the perception came in India and in Asia that if you were lighter skinned, you were upper class. It had everything to do with the diet and science and nothing else. The third question was this, why has India, with 1.2 billion people, never won an Olympic track medal? So I looked at it, and that's, of course, Milkha Singh, as you'd know, and P.T. Usha, who both ended up finishing fourth, missing out on a bronze. And the last time I was in India for a book launch, this Bhag Milkha Bhag movie was on. And as you know, it's the inspirational story of Milkha Singh, family being torn apart by partition and literally running for his life to India and later running for glory. And this wonderful story of Milkha Singh, we've got to go back to talking about the vitamin D I was telling you earlier. So Asian people were all vitamin D deficient, and what vitamin D does is it increases your muscle strength and also increases the size of the bones. So what it means is, because we were vitamin D deficient, if we supplemented children from birth vitamin D and made sure they had adequate vitamin D levels, what you'd find is we'd all be 2 to 3 inches taller, but also you'd be better athletes. The other interesting thing in Europe was the darker skinned people from Africa, when they migrated into Europe, again, those who could lighten their skin survived, but those who couldn't lighten got bred out. And also those who couldn't lighten the skin because of genetic the way their genes were, they developed rickets. And as you know, rickets is vitamin D deficiency. It either makes you infertile, or on other count, it makes you bent and stooped over and smaller. So if you were bent and stooped over and smaller, naturally there was a perception that you were inferior. So that's where the feelings of racial superiority came from. So the entire thing can be really explained from science. And as Swami Vivekananda said, I just saw a poster of him just outside as I was coming in here, all differences in the world are of degree and not of kind, because oneness is the secret of everything. And if you ask skin, it would agree, because it couldn't really go back and change the way we evolved. So I'd like to just finish this presentation with a poem from another book of poetry, and it's called Democracy. And it says, I'm saying democracy, I'm saying equality. World's not saying fraternity, it doesn't talk. Not epidermis, nor dermis, nor genes separate us, but scientific truth remain unspoken. I'm saying sun damage, I'm saying aging. Skin doesn't say it's old, it doesn't talk. Our lifestyles are imperfect, our actions and diets are millstones, as time remains relative. I'm saying science, I'm saying emotion. Skin doesn't choose partners, it doesn't talk. But we see skin color when we long for somebody's presence, whether it's a black truth or a white lie.
Thank you, Sharad, for that illuminating insight into some aspects of your work and some of the background of the history of the skin. I practice medicine in the UK, and there's a substantial number of my patients are of Indian origin in terms of their ethnicity. And there are a lot of problems with vitamin D deficiency among that population that we're only starting to begin to acknowledge the extent of. I learned something fascinating in your book, which was to do with how we generate vitamin D, and I would wondered if you could discuss that in terms of the fact that many people actually don't get enough vitamin D. Many of us are chronically deficient, and what's the best way we can counteract that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think first of all, vitamin D is produced, by exposure to sunlight, but it saturates at about 20 to 30 minutes. So you don't really need more time in the sun to produce vitamin D, that's one. The second thing is what we know is that you need about 24% of body surface area exposed to get enough vitamin D. So if you're just going out and only your face is exposed to the sun, you're probably not going to get enough vitamin D. So you at least need your arms exposed, arms and legs, some sort of like shorts and t-shirt kind of stuff. The other thing, of course, is the diet. Like what I was saying earlier, if you look at people in Bengal, even the Brahmins, they used to eat fish. So over time, you can see the Bengali Brahmins had darker skin compared to people elsewhere. So you could actually explain the whole thing scientifically.
That's fascinating. And again, thinking about the cultural aspects of skin, so you've made us understand that actual cultural eating practices ultimately evolve the color of your skin.
Yes.
Other cultural practices in terms of skin that coming from New Zealand, I wondered if you would chat about is tattooing. Have you ever come across any difficulties caused by tattooing, any either vitamin type problems or more physiological inflammatory reactions?
Yeah, more only really inflammatory problems. I think, tattoos are obviously increasingly more common. And all I can say is the most common request I get for tattoo removal is to remove the name of the previous boyfriend. So really, my advice to you is if you want, get a flower or a mountain or something, but not anybody's name, not even yours if you want to change it later. Yeah, but with regard to tattoo, there's no other effect other than if it's not done properly, sometimes it's done too deep, and so, of course, it can cause more of an inflammatory reaction. And the second thing, of course, is, of course, it's not an issue in New Zealand because they're regulated, but in other places you want to be careful that you're not picking up any hepatitis and kind of infections and things like that.
There's a very interesting passage in the book which explains the physiology of how our skin cells work, and it explains that the pigment that gives us the darkness of our skin is arranged in tiny little vessels which actually are positioned over the nucleus of the cell where the DNA is. So they're actually arranged like little parasols, protecting the genetic material in our bodies. That's what they do. And I would like to ask you to give us a sense of just how thin is this skin deep colouring that we're discussing, because it's extraordinarily close to the surface.
Yes, I think the first thing is actually an interesting point, a very good question, because first thing is what most people don't know is that we all lose 200 grams of skin every day. Just from walking around, you're having skin flakes falling off you. And in some people who have, certain conditions where you produce a lot of skin flaking, like psoriasis or something like that, it actually goes higher. Because I've got some patients and they come in and they take off their shirt and I need to whip out my umbrella so that the flakes all fall out. No, just kidding. But literally, we all lose 200 grams a day. But here's what's interesting. The entire weight of the melanin, which Gavin and I, by the way, have the same amount of melanin. It's 1.5 grams, right? It is so minuscule, and each of us have got the same amount of melanin in our cells, and that's why I was saying the concept of race is scientifically rubbish. But melanin is an antioxidant, so that's why it evolved when people moved to where there was harsher UV rays. the skin darken because melanin is an antioxidant. So what happens is when you have melanin in darker skin, it's arranged in a larger granule, and if this is your nucleus where all your DNA is stored, when you're out in the sun, it sort of fans out like an umbrella, and that's why you tan evenly. But I have a lot of patients who come from Scotland, and I always tell them that freckling is really a pathetic attempt at tanning, right, from a scientific point of view, because the cells have got a lot of little dots. They're not all uniform, so they don't spread out evenly. So, you know, in India, we're lucky that we can tan, so, you know, we should get more sunlight.
So yeah, I like that idea of the Scots as pathetic tanners.
That's it.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. There's a lovely passage also in Sherrod's book which explores the origins of ourselves as human beings. And when we are embryos forming in our mother's wombs, our skin comes from a very distinct part of that process. And there's a quote in there that says, from a famous geneticist, Lewis Wolpert, it says, "Not birth, marriage, or death, but gastrulation is the most important time of your life." Can you explain that?
Yes, yeah, that's just a passage where our cells, skin cells and brain cells form at the same time. So that's why the skin is a sense organ for the 8th to 12th week of life. So at that time when the initial cells sort of form into clumps from where they're going to differentiate, that's the time which determines what happens to our DNA. And that's why that's the most important time of our life. Whatever happens afterwards, like in that quote, you know, a birth or death or marriage or divorce, pale into insignificance. Who wants questions to the audience?
Okay, we're just going to, we've got 10 minutes left, or 12 minutes left actually. We're going to open to questions. If I could see some hands, please, and we'll try and be as fair as we can. Any questions, Dr. Paul? Yes, there's a green shirt, hand raised here by the wall. Thank you.
Hello. My question to you is, there was this chart earlier in your presentation showing that continents with darker skin tone have more population,
yes,
generally. I want you to lay more light about China. How do you explain scientifically China being the most populated country in the world?
See, Chinese skin is actually not European skin, so all Asian skin actually have more melanin. Right, the Chinese skin so Chinese skin actually came out of European skin with the migration, just like Indian skin. So it's a subtle tone, but it's actually from scientific point of view, it has as much melanin. So there are parts of China where there's more sun, for example, as you come south, or you go further down into Asia, like in Thailand and places like that, people are actually a little more browner. And that's just because where the sun is more, they're more tanned. So they do have an ability to tan. All right, so it's the tanning ability which really makes a difference.
Next question, please. Yes, there's a gentleman with a brown hat at the front here. Yep. Wait for the microphone, please.
I want to ask, you know, the world population, only 5% or 10% people who are very literate, but 95% or 90% they are illiterate. In the nutshell, in the summary, I want to ask you what is good and what is bad for skin.
Anything which is, I guess the skin, fundamentally, skin is just reflecting what's happening inside. So there's a passage in the book which says, you know, if your liver is bad or your kidney is bad, they can hide under layers of, I suppose, their skin. But skin basically reflects what's going on inside you. So you can't have bad health, you can't have a bad liver and have good skin. You can't abuse your body by drinking a lot and eating a lot of sugar and end up with having good skin. So fundamentally, skin is just a reflector of what's going on inside. So whatever is generally good for health, as we know, low sugar, plenty of fruits, vegetables. Specifically, if you ask me about skin foods that are good for skin, then I would say things like, obviously, in India, turmeric, vitamin C containing ones, so like oranges, I'd say broccoli, tropical ginger. Internationally, I would say blueberries. All those are exceptionally good for skin, but generally they're good for health as well.
And there's a lady in red nearby there. Yeah.
It's working. how to look young forever, secret mantra.
There we go, how to look young forever.
That's it. Forever, first of all, you'd have to live forever to look young forever, right? So I think once we've solved that problem, then I deal with how to make that skin look better. But generally speaking, I think if you're talking about what do we know which affect aging, at a molecular level, we now study specific pathways, and what we know is this: the same pathways of antioxidants, like the NRF2 pathway, for example, are ones which are affected for injury, illness, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and aging. In other words, if you live in a stressful situation, you will look older. If you have a chronic injury which has not been treated, you will look older. If you have cancer, you will look older. If you are healthier, you will look younger. Right, so that's the thing. People always say, you know, what do you do about your health or something like that? From my point of view, I just think you have to just live a balanced, not avoid putting too many toxins into your body.
Right, there's a lady there that's had her hand up with a turquoise blue jumper on in the middle of the row.
Are there any stark evolutionary predictions you can tell us about skin?
As what's going to happen? Yes, we can. Like we definitely know that now, see, our diets weren't homogeneous in the past. So what I mean is, like I was saying to you, when people were in Europe, there were certain parts which could farm grain, but certain parts they couldn't farm grain. Like when I've been to Iceland, there's hardly any grass there, so they eat whales because they were the cows of the sea, basically, right? So, but what's happened now is we virtually all eat the same diet. So our cereals are fortified. So therefore, there's a gradual browning of the population. If we last 2,000 years, generally most of the populations will be browner. In areas like Australia, New Zealand will be quite dark, and there would be virtually very little difference from our skin type and European skin type. The issue is whether we'll last 2,000 years as the way we're going with the planet. But if we did last that long, we'd all be a lot more homogeneous, and we can see that scientifically.
There's a gentleman on this left-hand side with a brown jumper on, third in from the aisle, who's had his hand up for a while. Thank you.
I have basically two questions. First is that how much smoking affects your skin? And question number two is that why most of the Indians have dark circles? Thank you.
You mean dark circles around your eyes is what you're talking about? Yeah. Okay, first thing about smoking is, I wouldn't presume that you're a smoker, are you? No, just kidding. The thing with smoking is smoking affects the microcirculation, so the small blood vessels. So wherever you have, you know, smaller blood vessels like the skin, obviously it's quite bad for you. So you will age more because when you smoke, it causes cellular damage, it uses up your antioxidants, so you will look older, you look more wrinkled. It can also, therefore, dark circles basically caused by melanization, and there are many causes, sometimes inflammation, sometimes in the diet. It's a bit complicated to explain it in one question, but all I can say is the book after the skin book, which is called Democracy, which is there as a specific chapter on dark circles.
And there's a lady here with glasses near the red partition wall there, who's had her hand up for a while. Thank you.
Thank you. So you talked about how skin is like a reflection of whatever happens inside your body. So what about illnesses like psoriasis, right? So you can't completely eradicate them. So is this something that's chronologically like inside the body? And how would something like smoking and alcohol affect psoriasis, if it does at all?
Okay, two things. First of all is that the skin for an individual reflects what's going on the inside. Now, certain conditions, see, are genetic, right? So for things like psoriasis, you have to have a genetic predisposition. So somebody in your family may also have it. So your reality would be psoriasis is the new normal for you. So your psoriasis will get bad if you have other things going on inside. Now, what alcohol does, as we know, is alcohol is the biggest dehydrating agent known to mankind. So you see, when we study tissues under the microscope, if I cut out a skin cancer and want to analyze it, all we do is we keep putting it in serial layers of alcohol till it becomes like wax because all the water is drained out. So if you imagine your skin is already dry and full of flakes, and you're dehydrating it by having alcohol. That's why it makes it worse. And with regard to smoking, there's not so direct an effect, it's just an effect on the small blood vessels. But alcohol has a direct effect on psoriasis just because it dehydrates it much more.
Now, I'm afraid this is going to be the last question, but please do come and speak to Dr. Paul outside in the signing. There's a lady with a red top here in the middle of the right-hand side who's had her hand up for a while. So this is the last question. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. So first of all, I would like to say that you have a lot of clarity in your speech. You really explain really well. Yeah. So my question to you is that how to do away with premature graying of hair? Is it related to the skin?
It's partly genetic. We do know that certain things like, if you have metabolic problems, sometimes you can gray more faster. But generally, graying of the hair from the hair follicles largely is genetic. And what I'm trying to get at is if it's a parent or a grandparent was gray prematurely and you inherit the gene, then you could gray prematurely. So, yeah. But of course, nowadays we get plenty of hair dye, so it's nothing to worry.
Wait, so
Sorry? If not genetic, yes, typically then you'll need like blood tests and things to see if you've got a metabolic condition going on. You want to rule out things like thyroid, the various other things which can do that.
So thank you for that, Dr. Paul. I will hope everybody here is going to go away. They're going to not smoke, not drink alcohol. They're going to expose 24% of their bodies for half an hour twice a day and eat plenty of fish. Now, thank you for a fascinating session. Please do come and join us in the queue.
Thank you, Sharad Paul and Gavin Francis, for this interesting session and enlightening session on the authors will be available for book signing outside. So if you have a book you want to get signed, they will be just outside on the left-hand side. We will continue with our program in 15 minutes, so stay with us. It will be the session Tales of the City. Please also do take your litter with you. Don't leave any waste or any belongings here. Just take everything with you so that we can keep the venue clean.